It's no secret our relationship with the United States has reached historic lows.
More than $900 billion in annual trade, over 4 million barrels of oil per day, nearly half of the aluminum used in American vehicles, and more than $40 billion a year in tourism spending, all of it suddenly placed at risk by a single sentence from Canada in early 2026. When Canadian leader Mark Carney declared Canada does not live because of the United States, markets did not hear rhetoric. They heard a warning. Within hours, United States auto manufacturers with exposure to Canadian supply chains lost tens of billions of dollars in market value. Fertilizer and energy markets spiked. Investment desks quietly began stress testing scenarios that, until recently, were considered unthinkable. A Canada that no longer treats economic dependence on the United States as inevitable. What makes this moment so dangerous is not the rhetoric itself, but what followed it. Strategic planning, market repositioning, and quiet international coordination that suggests Canada's declaration was backed by far more than words. Listen to the very end today, because what I am about to reveal is a strategic move so severe that it could inflict economic damage on the United States, measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, a plan never publicly disclosed, and one that Washington was never prepared to confront. For decades, American policymakers treated Canada as a stable extension of the domestic supply base. The numbers tell a far more dangerous story. More than $900 billion in goods and services move across the United States-Canada border every year. Over 60% of American manufacturing output contains at least one critical Canadian input, whether energy, metals, chemicals, or intermediate components. When even a fraction of that flow is disrupted, the consequences do not remain localized. They cascade. Energy is the most immediate fault line. Canada supplies the United States with more than 4 million barrels of oil every single day, more than the combined total of all OPEC nations. Canadian electricity exports stabilize large portions of the Northeast and Midwest power grid. Internal modeling by regional utilities indicates that a reduction of just 10% in Canadian electricity flows could push wholesale power prices up by more than 40% within weeks, adding an estimated $200 billion in cumulative costs to American households and businesses over 3 years. Grid instability on that scale would have been considered unthinkable a decade ago. It is now a modeled scenario. The auto industry faces an even sharper edge. Nearly half of all aluminum used in United States vehicle manufacturing originates in Canada, prized for its low carbon profile and consistent quality. Emergency substitution from overseas suppliers increases production costs by 20 to 30% per vehicle, according to supplier modeling. If Canadian aluminum and battery-grade minerals are redirected elsewhere, cumulative losses to the United States auto sector could exceed $400 billion by the end of the decade, with between 800,000 and 1 million manufacturing jobs placed at risk across the Midwest and South. Agriculture presents a quieter but no less explosive vulnerability. Roughly 80% of the fertilizer used by American farmers depends on Canadian potash. A sustained increase in fertilizer prices of 30% would reduce crop yields by double digits across multiple staples, driving food inflation to levels not seen in half a century and inflicting annual export losses exceeding $150 billion. Tourism delivers the final blow. Canadian travelers historically inject more than $40 billion a year into the United States economy. Early 2026 data shows a collapse in Canadian travel to American destinations ranging from 30 to 60% in key states, placing more than 1 million service sector jobs at risk and setting the stage for cumulative losses approaching $250 billion. And this is only the visible damage, because the next move Canada made was not about trade at all. It was about leverage, and it was never meant to be seen. What transformed this confrontation from a trade dispute into a systemic threat was not a tariff announcement, a speech, or a headline-grabbing sanction. It was a quiet shift in leverage that most American decision makers failed to notice until the numbers began to surface. In the first half of 2026, Canada began redirecting long-term supply commitments away from the United States across multiple strategic categories simultaneously. Energy contracts were the first signal. More than 1 million barrels per day of future Canadian oil output were quietly reallocated toward non-United States buyers through long-dated agreements. At the same time, new electricity export frameworks prioritize transatlantic and domestic grid resilience over cross-border expansion. United States energy analysts estimate that this shift alone could add more than $300 billion in cumulative energy costs to the American economy over 5 years through higher prices, volatility, and emergency infrastructure spending. Critical minerals followed. Canada controls a dominant share of reliable supply for nickel, potash, uranium, and battery-grade inputs essential to electric vehicles, semiconductors, and defense manufacturing. Internal industry modeling suggests that a sustained diversion of just 20% of Canadian critical mineral exports away from the United States could delay or cancel more than $300 billion in planned American industrial and defense production over the next decade. The employment impact tied to those delays is estimated at more than 1 million jobs, many of them concentrated in regions already experiencing manufacturing decline. Finance was the least visible and most dangerous front. Canadian institutions began reducing exposure to United States-denominated settlement in new cross-border trade arrangements. Even modest diversification away from dollar-based settlement, measured at less than 15% of new trade flows, increases funding costs for American borrowers and weakens the financial leverage Washington has historically relied upon. Over time, analysts warn this could translate into hundreds of billions of dollars in higher federal borrowing costs, compounding existing fiscal pressure. The combined effect of these moves is staggering. Conservative aggregation of energy, manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, and financial exposure suggests that the United States faces potential cumulative economic losses exceeding $1 trillion over the next decade if current trajectories continue. This is not a recessionary shock that can be reversed with stimulus. It is a structural repricing of risk driven by the loss of assumed access. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is that Canada did not act alone. Other advanced economies began mirroring these adjustments, quietly reducing their vulnerability to American volatility by following the same playbook. Each move appears manageable in isolation. Together, they represent a slow but deliberate erosion of United States economic leverage. And this is where the story becomes far more alarming, because the next phase does not depend on Canada's actions at all. It depends on how quickly other allies replicate the same strategy and what happens to the United States economy once that threshold is crossed. By the second half of 2026, the consequences were no longer theoretical models discussed in boardrooms. They began showing up in paychecks, grocery bills, energy statements, and unemployment lines across the United States. The first shock landed in manufacturing employment. As Canadian inputs became more expensive or less reliable, production slowdowns spread rapidly through the Midwest and South. Internal labor market data compiled by state agencies showed manufacturing layoffs accelerating at a pace not seen since the global financial crisis. Within 12 months, more than 1 million American manufacturing jobs were either eliminated or placed on indefinite furlough. When supplier networks and logistics firms were included, total job losses tied directly to Canadian supply disruption exceeded 1,600,000 positions nationwide. Inflation followed close behind. Energy costs surged as refiners and utilities scrambled to replace Canadian supply on less favorable terms. Average household electricity expenses increased by more than $1,500 per year in several northern states. Fuel costs rippled through transportation and food distribution, amplifying price pressure across the economy. By late 2026, food prices had risen at an annual pace exceeding 20%, driven largely by fertilizer shortages and declining crop yields. For middle-income households, this translated into the sharpest decline in real purchasing power in more than 50 years. Housing and local government finances soon felt the strain. Rising energy and construction material costs pushed home building activity sharply lower, deepening shortages and driving rents higher. Municipal budgets in border states deteriorated rapidly as tourism revenue collapsed and social assistance spending surged. Several states quietly requested emergency federal support to stabilize unemployment insurance systems strained by job losses tied to trade and energy disruption. The service sector, often assumed to be insulated, proved anything but. As Canadian tourism spending evaporated, hospitality and retail employment cratered. Nationally, more than 1,800,000 service sector jobs disappeared within 18 months, concentrated in Florida, Maine, Nevada, New York, and Arizona. Entire local economies built around cross-border travel entered what economists described as a demand death spiral, where lost income fed further job losses and business closures. The fiscal consequences were staggering. Slower growth, higher unemployment, and rising borrowing costs combined to widen the federal deficit by more than $1 trillion over 3 years. Debt servicing expenses alone increased by hundreds of billions annually, crowding out spending on infrastructure, healthcare, and social security. For the first time in decades, analysts began openly questioning whether the United States could maintain its traditional economic leadership without a fundamental shift in strategy. Perhaps the most destabilizing impact was psychological. Consumer confidence collapsed as Americans realized that the pain was not the result of a natural disaster or a global pandemic, but of a policy confrontation that delivered no clear benefit. Polling data showed a sharp rise in public opposition to economic coercion strategies once job losses and price increases were explicitly linked to conflict with Canada. And yet, even as the damage mounted, Washington faced a far more dangerous reality. Because what Americans were experiencing was only the first wave. The next phase would not be driven by Canada's actions alone, but by the moment when other allies decided the cost of staying tied to the United States was higher than the cost of walking away, a moment that, according to internal projections, was already approaching faster than anyone in Washington was prepared to admit. By the time Washington began to publicly acknowledge the scale of the damage, the United States economy was already approaching a structural breaking point. What made this phase different from every previous crisis was speed. Unlike a recession that unfolds over years, this shock propagated through multiple systems at once. Trade, energy, labor, finance, and consumer confidence deteriorated simultaneously, amplifying one another. Internal economic models circulated among federal agencies projected that if current trajectories persisted, total cumulative losses to the United States economy could exceed $2 trillion within 8 years. That figure did not include secondary losses tied to reduced innovation, delayed infrastructure investment, or long-term productivity decline. The labor market showed signs of systemic strain. Combined manufacturing and service sector job losses tied to supply disruption, energy volatility, and tourism collapse approached 3 million positions nationwide. In several industrial regions, unemployment rates doubled within 18 months. Emergency assistance programs expanded rapidly, adding hundreds of billions in unplanned federal spending. State unemployment trust funds in multiple regions faced insolvency, forcing Washington to intervene to prevent outright failure. Financial stress followed. As trade flows weakened and borrowing costs climbed, United States corporate defaults surged. Analysts tracking credit markets recorded the fastest rise in distressed debt since the global financial crisis. Pension funds and retirement accounts suffered sharp valuation declines, erasing years of gains for middle-income Americans. Household net worth fell by trillions, not because of market panic alone, but because the underlying economic engine had lost reliability. Perhaps most alarming was the erosion of confidence in the United States as a stable anchor of the global system. Foreign direct investment inflows slowed sharply as capital sought jurisdictions perceived as less politically volatile. Canada, Europe, and parts of Asia absorbed a growing share of long-term investment once destined for American projects. Over a 5-year horizon, net investment diversion away from the United States was estimated at more than $1 trillion, weakening growth prospects well beyond the immediate crisis. At the federal level, fiscal pressure reached a critical threshold. Slower growth combined with higher interest expenses widened the deficit at a pace that alarmed even veteran budget analysts. Projections showed debt servicing costs consuming an ever larger share of revenue, constraining the government's ability to respond to future shocks. For the first time in generations, policymakers were forced to confront a reality long dismissed as theoretical, that economic leverage, once lost, cannot be easily rebuilt. What made this collapse phase so destabilizing was its origin. There was no natural disaster, no global pandemic, no external war. The damage was self-inflicted, driven by a strategy that assumed intimidation would always be cheaper than adaptation. Instead, the costs compounded until the system itself began to buckle. And yet, the most dangerous moment still lies ahead, because there is one final threshold, quietly tracked by economists and central planners, that marks the point of no return. Once crossed, the United States would no longer be able to restore its former leverage, no matter how aggressively it escalates or how quickly it retreats. Behind closed doors in Washington, one number began to dominate internal briefings by late 2026. It was not inflation. It was not unemployment. It was not gross domestic product. It was dependency risk. Economic planners quietly concluded that once more than 1/4 of United States critical supply inputs were diversified away by allies, American leverage would enter irreversible decline. That threshold, according to multiple independent modeling exercises, marks the point at which coercive pressure stops producing compliance and starts accelerating exit. By the end of 2026, analysts estimated that the United States had already crossed roughly 2/3 of that threshold. The numbers were sobering. Combined diversification across energy, critical minerals, advanced manufacturing inputs, and trade settlement mechanisms suggested that allied economies had reduced future exposure to the United States by nearly 18% in less than 12 months. If the pace continued for another 2 years, Washington would face a permanent loss of influence over trade flows representing more than $10 trillion in global economic activity. No modern power has ever reversed such a shift once it became embedded in long-term contracts and infrastructure. The consequences extend far beyond trade. Defense planning models showed that reduced interoperability and non-United States procurement could eliminate more than $500 billion in future American defense exports over a decade. That loss would not only affect manufacturing jobs, but also erode the strategic influence that comes from setting standards, doctrine, and technology pathways. Once allies train, equip, and plan outside United States systems, reintegration becomes prohibitively expensive. Financial influence showed similar stress. Even modest reductions in dollar-based settlement among allied trade flows increased long-term funding costs for the United States government. Over a 10-year horizon, analysts projected additional interest expenses exceeding $1 trillion, compounding fiscal strain and limiting Washington's ability to respond to future crises. This was not a market panic scenario. It was a slow repricing of trust. Perhaps the most alarming projection involved living standards. Models incorporating slower growth, higher borrowing costs, and sustained energy and food inflation suggested that median American household income could stagnate or decline in real terms for an entire decade. The cumulative loss in household purchasing power was estimated at several $1 trillion nationwide, quietly reshaping social and political stability. What makes this threshold so dangerous is its invisibility. There is no single announcement, no headline declaring that leverage has been lost. The shift happens quietly, contract by contract, corridor by corridor, alliance by alliance. By the time it becomes visible to the public, it is already too late to reverse. And this brings us to the most unsettling reality of all. Because Canada was never the final target of this strategy. It was the proof of concept. In the final part, I will expose why this confrontation was not an accident, how it fits into a much larger global recalibration, and why the outcome may leave the United States facing a world where its power is no longer assumed but negotiated and often ignored. By the end of 2026, The confrontation had ceased to be about Canada, trade disputes, or even economic losses measured in the trillions. It had become a referendum on whether the United States could still shape the global system by pressure alone. The accumulated damage was now undeniable. Across energy, manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, defense, and finance, conservative aggregation of losses pointed to a cumulative economic hit exceeding $3 trillion over a single decade. More than 4 million American jobs were directly or indirectly placed at risk. Household purchasing power had been permanently impaired. Federal fiscal space narrowed as debt servicing consumed an ever larger share of national resources. These were not temporary setbacks. They were structural shifts. Yet the most consequential loss could not be captured on a balance sheet. It was the loss of automatic compliance. For generations, American leadership rested on an unspoken assumption shared by allies and adversaries alike, that alignment with Washington was safer than independence. In 2026, that assumption cracked. Canada demonstrated that a close ally could absorb pressure, diversify risk, and emerge with greater autonomy rather than collapse. Once proven, that lesson spread faster than any tariff or sanction ever could. Inside Washington, the realization arrived too late. Escalation now risked accelerating global exit. Retreat risked confirming the limits of coercion. Compromise, once seen as weakness, quietly became the only path left to prevent further erosion. Power that must be demanded is no longer power that can be relied upon. History rarely turns on a single speech or policy decision. It turns when beliefs change. The belief that the United States could impose costs without bearing them has been replaced by a harsher reality. In a deeply integrated world, coercion rebounds. The harder it is applied, the faster leverage decays. And here is the final shock. The damage you have heard today is not the end state. It is the entry price. Because once allies internalize that independence is survivable, they do not rush back. They redesign their future to ensure they never have to choose submission again. The question confronting the United States now is not whether it can still pressure others. It is whether it can still persuade them. And that answer will determine whether American power stabilizes or continues to bleed quietly, year after year, long after the headlines move on.